welcome to today's show. This is Community Connections with Anna. I am your host, Anna Orr, and today's guest will be Mr. Bill English.
Ijoollee keenya COVID-19 irraa haa ittifnu. Ijoollee umrii 5 fi achi olii qabaannaan talaalchisuu ni dandeettu. Talaalliin Pfizer ijoollee umrii 5 fi achi oliitiif kennamaa jiraachuu isaa quba qabdu. Eeyyeen jalqabee kennamaa jira. Ijoolleen dhibee COVID-19 qabamuu waan danda'aniif talaalliin kun fayyaa daa'immanii eeguu fi ittisuuf ni gargaara. Talaalliin COVID-19 ijoolleef kennamaa jiru miidhaa kan hin qabne bilisaa fi bu'a qabeessa. Tanaafuu talaalliin COVID-19 dhibee ittisa malee dhibee nama hin qabsiisu. Talaallii COVID-19 fudhachuudhaan maatii hunda dhibee COVID-19 irraa haa ittisnu.
Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the show, Mr. Bill English. I'm happy to have you.
Thank you, Anna. It's good to be here, and I'm excited about appearing on this channel.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and jump right on in.
Sure.
Can you share with me just a little bit about your background and where you're from and how you ended up here in Minneapolis?
Actually, I was born in a place called Marianna, Arkansas, delivered by a midwife.
Wow.
On May 18th, 1934. And my family moved to East St. Louis when I was 4 years old. And my father was looking for work. It was the ending of the Depression. He was working as a porter in Marianna.
Can you explain what a porter is for those that don't know?
A porter is someone who kind of cleans up the place and run errands and move things around and deliver sometimes.
Okay.
So they wanted to find a job. My mother had relatives in East St. Louis, actually Brooklyn, Illinois, which is a suburb of East St. Louis, which was the first and the oldest all-black town in the United States.
Wow.
It was founded by slaves who swam across the Mississippi because Missouri was a slave state. And it was named after Elijah P. Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist, a white abolitionist, who wrote a newspaper about freeing the slaves. So they knew if they could get across that river, they could get to Alton, Illinois, where his paper was published. Well, when he swam across the river, he found this land, and it was unclaimed. So they formed this town. The county had named that territory Brooklyn, but they formally named it Lovejoy, Illinois, after Elijah P. Lovejoy. They actually burned his paper down and killed him, and but they couldn't bother the slaves because the slaves were free, and they were protected by the state of Illinois at that point. And so that's where I grew up, in an all-black town. There was one white person who lived in the town. And I attended all elementary school, high school there. I then got a scholarship to Lincoln University, but for personal reasons, I couldn't accept the scholarship. And I had to get married. And so I got married, and I was drafted for the Korean War.
Wow.
And so I went into the Korean War. I served 3 years in Korea during the war. And I came back and decided I was going to finish my education under the GI Bill, which was free tuition if you'd been in the military and served in the war. And you got a little stipend as well. So I moved to, I enrolled at Eastern Michigan in Ypsilanti, Michigan. I enrolled there because they gave me some money to go to school, and so that helped. And so I finished my degree in sociology. Got divorced with one son. And I finished my education there and went to work at a federal prison as a parole officer. And that was like going to jail every day, because everywhere you go, you had to take a key, unlock it, and then hand the keys back to an officer. And I found out they weren't trying to really rehabilitate anyone. So this glory-eyed social worker that was going to change the world found out prison was not a place to do that. They wanted to incarcerate people. They didn't want to rehab them. So I decided at the spur of the moment to come to Minnesota and go to grad school. Now, how did I know about Minnesota? Well, I knew about Minnesota because I had came through on a troop train when I got out of the service, and we had to spend the night here. And I walked around, thought it was a lovely place, and it was much calmer, and I decided, when I decided I couldn't work in a prison anymore, that I would come to Minnesota and go to grad school. And Anna, I literally came here 2 weeks before Labor Day and talked my way into grad school.
Wow. How did the transition from coming from East St. Louis, coming from the prison, and then coming to Minneapolis, what type of culture shock, if any, was that?
Well, it was a very cultural, the first culture shock was leaving Illinois and going into the military. I wish I had the courage to do what Muhammad Ali did later and not fight. But I didn't have the courage in those days, and it didn't even occur to me that one could have that courage. And so I went into the Army. That was a shock, because they were just getting ready to desegregate the Army. Up until that time, the Army was segregated. You had black troops and white troops, and you didn't sleep together in the same barracks, anything. So the first culture shock was to find out how racist the military was. And then secondly, after leaving the military, which is a totally different culture, highly disciplined, the war left changed me forever. Combat is no fun. You spend every day expecting not to live to the end of the day. And so anyway, that made me want to further my education. If I got out alive, I was going to finish my education. And so I did get out alive, thank God. And then I, after when I was in school, I read about this wonderful woman that had written a book, and she had wrote the book on group dynamics for youth development. And I wanted to study under her. So I came here 2 weeks before Labor Day, went and found her and spoke to her. And I said, I got to get into grad school. Can you help me? Will you help me? She said, with that kind of nerve, I'm going to help you. And she did. And Gisela, as she preferred us to call her, was a Jewish person who had escaped Nazi as a child, Germany. And she came to Minnesota and was a professor. She really should have been the dean of the School of Social Work because she was that brilliant. But in those days, a deported Jewish woman was not allowed to be the dean of anything. So anyway, I studied under her, got out. My wife became pregnant at that time, and the doctor said she was going to be flat of her back to make it through the pregnancy. And so I had to drop out of school and take a job. I was working as an orderly at General Hospital in those days while I was going to school. But I needed a full-time job then. So actually, I picked up the Star Tribune and read classified ads, found out that 3M was recruiting salesmen. And today we would call it salesperson. Anyway, all you needed was a degree. And they paid good money. So I applied for the job. And I kept getting interviewed higher up and higher up and up, and I wondered about that. I didn't know at that time I was the first black salesman ever hired by 3M. I found out after they hired me. Then they told me. And I was stunned. And so I spent 4 years there, and I made branch manager. And I was recruited by a startup computer company called Control Data. And they recruited me hard. First I said no. You know, I had a company car, I was making good money. 3M was a very staid company. Here this young computer company was coming on and they wanted to hire me.
Right.
And they really wanted to hire me as what would now be called a diversity officer.
Okay.
They wanted me to help them bring on people of color, African Americans in particular. And they wanted me to set up a recruiting program and bring them into compliance because they were doing a lot of federal government work. They sold computers for scientists and engineers. And so they wanted someone to help them get into compliance because they were basically, they built all their plants in the suburbs and they attracted a lot of women who was, because you were working under a magnifying glass and women had much more nimble fingers. So a lot of women. And the CEO of Control Data, this was during the so-called riots, I call them acts of insurrection, in California and Detroit. And so the government told them, you know, you don't have any people of color working for you. You get government contracts. So they decided during those riots, they called all the CEOs of the Fortune 100 companies to DC for a conference. Mm-hmm. And they took them upstate New York to a very wonderful retreat. And Whitney Young, who was then the national president of the National Urban League, and Bill Norris, the CEO of Control Data, were paired together as roommates. And Norris told me that they got to talking, and Whitney asked him, well, Whitney, who took his degree from the University of Illinois and had ran the St. Paul Urban League and had now become president of the National Urban League, which had 90 affiliates around the country. And so he said, you know, I spent some time in Minnesota. And he said, one of the things you can do is you should decide where you build your next plant. And so they actually recruited me to put a facility in North Minneapolis. So I put the first plant in North Minneapolis, is still there. Where public housing was Control Data Institute, where they trained people to install and maintain their equipment. Next door, they had a plant and hired, over 200 people. That had a huge financial impact on North Minneapolis.
So during this time, you were not only building community and starting to add things to your resume, but you also started fostering a lot of firsts, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, yeah, and that was very interesting. I ended up putting plants in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Washington, D.C., Oklahoma City, San Antonio, and a rural all-white town in Kentucky called Campton, Kentucky. Can you imagine in the 60s a black man going into a little town where I first realized that all poverty was not urban and black. I saw white women tremble when you turn on a machine. Nobody had more than an 8th grade education, and their fathers and grandfathers were dying from black lung disease from working in the coal mines.
So can you share with me a little bit about how working in the prison to coming to control data, leaving the Korean War, how did that start to shape your concern for people and the plight of people in communities?
Let me think about that for a moment. I think what first started to for me to start to believe that I had a responsibility was my mother. And I remember that each stage of my life, 8th grade education, high school, my mother recognized that I was a so-called a smart kid. And she would always tell me, son, you owe. She never stopped telling me that every major step in my life. She would say, remember, you standing on the shoulders of a lot of people, those first. She was reminding me that you owe. So it began to shape my thoughts about how America really had a debt to black people. I had studied history enough to know the impact that slavery had on America, and it had built the wealth. I began to really dig into the whole history of slavery and the impact. And I decided that if I could fight in a war for a country that was treating me second class, that I would never accept second classism for anyone again. That I was going to be a black man in America, and I was going to do everything I could to help make America become the dream that it portrayed in its Constitution. So that prompted my so-called activism. I consider myself a servant leader.
I was just about to say that. That led to my next question. I know that you refer to yourself as a servant leader. Can you kind of explain not only the definition of that, but also how you realized that is exactly what you wanted to use your O, as your mother said, to facilitate?
Primarily because if you owe, then you need to pay back. I wanted to use my brain, my concern for our people, that spurred me on to start to learn how to become a leader. So I started to work with other people in the community, had a thriving NAACP at that time, and the things that were going on in the world was shaping my life at the same time. So I became engaged in politics. I was a corporate executive by now. I spent 32 years at Control Data, 17 as a vice president. So I was again a first. And so the things that shaped me was a commitment to never accept anything but being equal. I don't sit at tables where I'm not equal. I don't accept racism in any form or fashion. And it spurred me on, and I learned a lot from people like Dr. Josie Johnson and her husband, Chuck Johnson, Cecil Newman, who started these Minneapolis Spokesmen, so many other people. And I remembered when just as I got out of the service, I met a man named Paul Peterson. Paul had spent 18 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. They finally found who really committed it. And he called me Billy, which I didn't like. And he said, Billy, you are really brilliant. And I said, come on, Paul. He said, no, you really are. And he said, you go out there and take charge of your life and do whatever it is you want to do, because you can be what you want to be. And he used the term, if you believe it, you can achieve it. So I had faith and confidence, probably overconfident, that there was nothing I couldn't do if I set my mind to it.
Well said. How has your family and your activism impacted one another? I know that you said when you came, you began, you came here to Minneapolis to go to grad school, but you also were about to become a first-time parent, correct?
Yes.
During that same time. So I assume that had to impact how you saw the world going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It did shape me. And that question is?
The question is, how has your activism impacted your family? How do those two things work in tandem?
Well, by now, I had 2 daughters. And I was busy working. And quite frankly, Anna, I think my first 3 children, my son by my previous marriage, were impacted because I was working and busy. But, you know, I was always a family man. I was there for everything, wherever it was in the world. And I traveled all over the world. I would call my children at 9 o'clock, Minneapolis time. I would set my alarm so I could make sure they were at home and doing well in school. So it had a huge impact on my family to that extent. But it also allowed me to influence my children. And I began to have some influence. By now, my life was being shaped, and I was being considered a young and upcoming leader. So I remember that time a reporter called me an activist. I said, I'm not that. I said, what do you mean? I said, use that term to dismiss who I really am. I said, I am a servant leader. I lead to serve my people, and in turn, help change America to be this republic, to be what its founders, who were hypocrites, excuse me, because you cannot write all men are created equal and then consider an African-American slave 3/5 of a human being. I was a friend of Dr. Mahmoud El-Qadi. We spent a lot of time talking about the history of black people in the world as opposed to the United States. I realized there were more people of color in the world than white people. And he referred me to a store in New York, a bookstore. Was owned by a famous black man, and it was called The House of Proper Propaganda. And here you found every book ever published by a black man or woman. And so I got to be working for 3M. I got a chance to travel to New York a lot. So every time I go, I spend hours in that bookstore, not only talking to him, but picking up books to read. And so all of those things shaped my life and in turn shaped my family. Because as I was leading, I was also teaching my children about how they owed and how they had to become active in their community and serve. And so all of my children find some way to serve, and I'm quite proud of them. My son passed away the same morning that Coretta Scott King died.
Wow.
And so that had a huge impact on me. Because quite frankly, he had suffered a lot because I was gone a lot. And I had some guilt about that. But before he died, we spent a lot of time together, and he was proud of me. And I forgot to tell you, I'm the oldest of 13 children.
That's important. That's important.
Very
That's
important.
The beginning of your leadership, right?
Yes.
Being the oldest of
Yes,
that many
yes.
children.
Yeah. But I'm the oldest of 13 children.
Wow.
And so all of those things shaped my life, my impact on my family, my impact on this community, and my impact on shaping the minds of young people.
So we've talked a little bit about how you got here, some of the work that you've done thus far. Can you share with me how you navigate or how you stay focused during times of hardship?
It is very tough. I believe as African Americans, because of our the way we have been oppressed, We all suffer from a bit of neurosis. You cannot help it if we understand psychology. So always carry a little bit of that neurosis. And that neurosis means you call what I call adaptive awareness.
Adaptive awareness. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. It means you have to be aware and you have to constantly reshape your thinking based on the circumstances which you're around. So you adopt to the awareness as you learn it. So all of the things, the acts of insurrection, the struggle for freedom, registering to vote. I actually went to Chicago and walked in Cicero with Dr. King. Wow. In that march to Cicero, through Cicero. And so during this time, as you know, the civil rights movement, I went to the first all-black political conference in Gary, Indiana, where they elected a first black mayor named Richard Hatcher. And people from all over the country came. There was probably 10,000 people in Gary. Way overwhelmed the town. And Ossie Davis was the keynote speaker. And I found it interesting. They would have an active actor who was engaged in civil rights, be the keynote speaker. And Anna, he started his speech off with the title, which was profound. And the title of his speech was, "It's not the rap, but it is the map. It's not the man, but it is the plan." Think about that. That means we needed to map out our future and we need to plan.
Right.
So planning is about everything. If you don't plan well, you can't react well. You're not aware. And you have to adapt that awareness. So those are the things that impacted my servant leadership, that helped inform me. I read a lot. I love to read. And so I read a lot about, I read a book called The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. And he was a Frenchman. But he talked about how the world treated African Americans, Africans, the continent, how they raped the continent, took its wealth under the ban of teaching them to be Christians and other religions, and was taking the wealth out of the country and that all shaped slavery. So I began to understand that the problem of racism was just not local, not in the United States. It was around the world. Look at what has happened to Africa. I studied Ethiopia, and I learned how the Ethiopians fought off the president of Italy. His name escaped me for a minute. It was Hitler, and his name will come to me. At 87, you don't always remember. His name will come to me in a minute. But anyway, they fought the Italians on the side of Germany in World War II. And the Ethiopians stood up to him and fought him, battled him, as the Ukrainians are battling the Russians now. So that's how Ethiopia became really a free nation, because of the courage of the Ethiopians in fighting off Italy and its wretched and foul and evil man that ran Italy at the time.
So we've talked a little bit about your journey here. We've talked about education. We've talked about your activism and your servant leadership. Do you have any advice for someone that is watching this program that says, I want to do more? You know, we've just had the culmination of the trial regarding Derek Chauvin and the other officers that were convicted of the murder of George Floyd. And so I'm sure there are so many people that feel lost about how they can do more, how they can plug in, or what should they do. Is there a piece of advice you'd like to share with them to go forward?
First of all, we have to be aware that all things are political. If you read the preamble to the Constitution, it says when government becomes oppressive, it becomes the duty of the oppressed to overthrow the oppressor. The duty to do that. So and I inform people by recognizing if things are political, then you decide who's your government. By registering to vote, I've never, over my lifetime since I was 18 years old, I spent every voting season registering some people to vote and then making sure all of my family scattered all over the world. You can imagine 13 kids. I got a lot of nieces and nephews.
I was going to say, once again, a testament to your excellent leadership and your ability to organize.
Yeah, well, I make sure they vote. I make sure that they vote. And I make sure that everybody I know vote. They know they're going to get a call from me on election day. Did you vote? Send me a picture nowadays with these cameras that you're at the voting booth. And they did that. And so I think it did help me to, my advice to anyone is to first of all remember you stand on the shoulders of giants. You stand on the shoulders of people who drove mule trains from the Carolinas to D.C. to build the Congress building and the White House. Not a dime was they paid for that. That was free. And they became skilled craftspeople. And they brought that with them from Africa. So remember Timbuktu. Remember that the pyramids were built. Egyptians saw themselves as black and brown people. They found that in the caves and the burial grounds, how they saw themselves.
True.
And so we know that we have to be engaged. We have a responsibility to be engaged. We have to educate ourselves on who is the right kind of leader. And then you got to vote. And you never accept second-class citizenship. Not one day in your life should you accept being anything but equal to anybody on the first day. That's whether you're a janitor or the head of a college. Walter Leonard, a very learned man who was a successful businessman in Atlanta. He built a huge real estate business. And at the age of 40, he was so successful that he decided to go back to Howard and enroll in law school. He graduated at the top of his class and was recruited by Derek Bach, then the president of Harvard. He hired Walter Leonard right out of law school as the only ever special assistant to the president of Harvard. Only one. He was a black man. And I met Walter through a friend. And as I was growing in the corporate world, becoming higher elected, by that time I had made vice president. And so I would talk to Walter about my struggles in a white world. And how could I maintain my dignity and actually change things? And he said something, Anna, that I have found to be absolutely true. So I said, Walter, some days I wonder if I'm really having the kind of impact. He said, Bill English, I don't know why you say that. I know who you are and what you've done so far. He said, but let me tell you something. Sometimes black folk, merely by their presence, can change things. If they are smart, listening, and can listen, and be reasonably articulate, they can damn sure change things. And that was profound. But I found out it to be true. And he said, for example, you can be a room, some things are not going to be said. And it's probably good that they're not said. but they're also going to say some things that you're going to learn and you're going to know, and how true that's turned out to be exactly true. Sometimes in the corporate world, in the political world, I find myself being at a table where some things were not said because they know they better not say it. not to build English. But I also learned what was really going on, where the power really existed, and how do you steal as much of that power away from them through your activism, through your determination, through the sheer will of our people. We have suffered for over 400 years in this country, but we have thrived, and still we rise, and still we rise in spite of that. Who would have thought my grandfather would have turned over in his grave and shouted if he realized that a black man served 2 terms as president of this republic? 2 terms. Had a huge impact, won the Nobel Peace Prize. Come on.
Absolutely.
This is real. This advice that I'm saying to you and to your audience, wherever you are in the world, you owe, because you stand on the shoulders of giants. The world cannot change if you're not willing to try to help change it. Power concedes nothing without a struggle. It never has, and it never will. And so we must always understand the struggle continues, and so it is.
We've talked about struggle and we've talked about change. I just heard you mention that you are 87 years old.
Yes.
Can you share with me what it means to you to witness Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson vying for a seat at the Supreme Court?
Well, what would one expect? But didn't you see some adaptive awareness in her testimony? Did you see it right in front of your eyes? She used her brilliance to show the ignorance of the people that were harshly criticizing her, and she reminded them always of the law and her dedication to the Constitution. In other words, she would never sit any place without being an equal. She showed them she was equal or better than they were. Think about the impact that had on young black women all over America and all over the world. When the United States finally elects a black woman to the Supreme Court, she will be appointed. And she will serve with dignity and brilliance unseen since Thurgood Marshall. And isn't it interesting? At the very time she's being nominated, we find out the only other black, Clarence Thomas, was really awful. He became a puppet to the white government. He acted on the Supreme Court as if he had never seen racism, and now we find out his white wife is corrupt. The day of the so-called insurrection, when they stormed the Congress building, she was on the phone texting the chief of staff to then President Trump, the outgoing defeated President Trump, or how to call for a war. Listen, we're on the throes of a civil war in America again. There are people out there who are white and will shoot you just because you're black. So we have a target on our back in America. But look, I'm optimistic. The Sounds of Blackness have a song called Optimistic.
That's right.
And the world should hear that song because it inspires us to be optimistic, and that will force us to struggle to be free. And so, I just believe with every fiber of my body that God put us on this earth to treat the poor, to serve the poor, to wake up every day. I watched my mother during the end of the Depression. And this is a human interest thing. There are people they call hobos.
Yes, sir.
There were men that would travel up and down the railroad, jumping on freight trains to get to where they could be free from the South. So they come through this little all-black town where I was born as they were coming north, either to go to St. Louis or Chicago or Detroit. And they would stop and knock on the back door. We lived near the railroad. And they would knock on the back door and say, "Ma'am, I'm hungry. Could I do some work for some food?" And she said, "Sir, I've got 4 big boys. There's no work they need to do. They chop wood, they do whatever I need to do. But if you're hungry," and she brought a wash pan out so they could wash their hands, and she would feed them. And then she would pack a lunch, whatever we had. She packed them a big lunch. Excuse me, and she said, "And now you've had one meal. You must share this with someone else. Promise me you will share this for someone that has not eaten today." And so when he walked away, I said, "Mama, why you give them people our food? You don't know them." She said, "Because we were taught. The Bible calls on us to feed the hungry, to serve the poor, to house the homeless, and to clothe the naked." That is my faith. That is what drives me every day to put on my big man pants and go to work to free our people. I'm dedicated that I owe, remember. Lorraine English said, "Boy, you owe." So I wake up every day with that challenge of how do I pay back for what God has been very good to me. I've made a good living. I've had all of the material things anyone could want. And who would have thought this poor kid from East St. Louis, or Brooklyn, rather, it's all black town, would become the vice president of a Fortune 100 company, who held his dignity and kept his dignity intact, never sucked up to anyone, who've been in the White House, but is comfortable in the pool room, who actually was interviewed by Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes. One day you have to Google the scam. In 1974, Mike Wallace, on the famous 60-minute program, came here to interview me. Being elected twice to who's who in Black America is meaningful to me because it recognizes the work that I have done. And so I let the work that I have done speak for me. Oh, that's a song.
That it is.
That is a song. So yes. So that drives me. It inspires me. I can't get tired. I don't have time to get tired. As my mother said, I'll wear out, but I won't rust out. That means stay busy. Stay busy. So that's what I do.
On that note, I just want to thank you for your time and for your servant leadership and your continued support and progression, and dedication to our community, Mr. English.
You owe me no thanks for that. First of all, it's a pleasure to be in your company. It is a pleasure to speak to your audience, my brothers and my sisters, wherever they are in the world. I love you. I respect you. I will continue to struggle and to fight for your freedom and your being treated with the dignity that God put in you the day you left the womb. So wherever you are in the world, I love you, I respect you, and I love, and you're my brother.
That is all the time we have today. Thank you again to our beloved guest, Mr. English, and to each one of you for watching with us today. I'll see you soon on the next episode.